The drop was never meant to be graceful. It began with light, violent, white, blinding light that cut through the clouds of Vega 9 like a blade. The atmosphere tore at the descent pods as the cadets plummeted through the thick orange sky. Inside one of those pods, Cadet Marcus Hale gripped the straps across his chest, counting each breath as turbulence battered the metal shell. Around him, alien cadets of different species struggled to maintain control. The insectoid Talor clicked her mandibles in panic. The reptilian Koresh hissed prayers to a forgotten god, and the feathered Vryle twitched her trembling wings against the cramped interior. None of them had ever been through a planetary descent without autopilot or stabilizers. None of them had ever touched dirt without an atmospheric shield. But this was the point. The Galactic Academy's survival trial was designed to break arrogance. Every cadet was stripped of gear, weapons, and neural implants. No tools, no data, no support. The instructors had said it with an almost cruel calm. You will survive with nothing but what your body allows you to build. The pods hit the jungle floor like falling meteors, scattering across a radius of 2 kilometers. When Marcus stumbled out, the world hit him with a suffocating wave of heat and noise. The air was dense, sweet with decay, and filled with the buzzing hum of unseen creatures. Vines the size of tree trunks coiled around mossy boulders, and translucent leaves hung like curtains between beams of amber sunlight. The ground was soft and steaming beneath his boots. Somewhere nearby, another pod cracked open, and he heard the Vryle cadet screaming in confusion. He took a moment to steady his breathing, tasting metal and acid in the air. The gravity was slightly heavier than Earth's, enough to make every motion drag. He felt the pull in his shoulders and spine as he unlatched his emergency harness and scanned the tree line. The alien cadets began to gather one by one. The Koresh, with his green scales and heavy frame, emerged first, his eyes darting like a predator's. Then came Talor, her segmented limbs shaking as her antennae flicked in distress. Last came the Vryle, still clutching her wing membrane as if to shield herself from the air. Each of them looked at Marcus with a kind of unspoken accusation. He was the only human, the only one without natural weapons, claws, or biological advantages. Yet, as the hours passed, he seemed the only one not falling apart. The Koresh tried to bite into the fibrous fruits dangling from the vines, but the acid inside burned his mouth. The Vryle tried to take flight, flapping upward through the canopy, but her wings became slick with moisture and dragged her back down. The insectoid Talor attempted to dig a shelter in the soil, but the ground collapsed inward, soaking her burrow in foul-smelling liquid. Every attempt to adapt failed spectacularly. By the first sunset, panic had set in. The alien cadets were creatures of civilization, engineered species used to biodomes, replicators, and automatic survival systems. None of them had ever been cold, hungry, or wet without a climate module humming beside them. Now, as the temperature dropped, the thick air grew cold and wet, condensing into droplets that stung like acid rain. The Vryle wrapped her wings around herself and whimpered softly. The Koresh tried to keep a fire going by rubbing sticks together, but his heavy claws splintered the wood. The insectoid simply curled up and shivered. Marcus sat a few meters away, watching the canopy sway under the strange twin moons. He wasn't immune to fear, but he was familiar with discomfort. His training on Earth had included wilderness survival in Siberian tundras and Saharan heat domes. He had been taught that the first step to surviving wasn't finding food or water. It was stopping panic before it spread. The aliens were already unraveling. He could see it in their breathing, their erratic movements, their refusal to think beyond instinct. He pulled himself up and began to walk through the clearing, searching the terrain by moonlight. The ground vegetation was thick, but his fingers found something familiar, the long, sinewy fibers of creeping vine plants. When he pulled on them, the vines resisted and stretched. He smiled faintly. Strength and flexibility, he thought, the basics of cordage. The Koresh noticed him working and hissed through sharp teeth. "What are you doing, human? We need weapons, not plants." Marcus didn't look up. "We need both," he replied. "But first, we need to bind things together. Rope before fire. Shelter before fighting." The reptilian scoffed and turned away, muttering something in his native tongue about mammals and madness. Marcus ignored him. He stripped the vines down with his hands, tearing away the outer bark to reach the fibrous interior. His palms burned from the friction, but he welcomed it. It meant he still had control. He twisted the fibers together, 2 at a time, then 4, then 8, until he had a rope strong enough to pull against his weight. The sound of the fibers creaking softly in his hands was oddly grounding. The jungle smelled of damp stone and rot. Somewhere in the darkness, a distant growl rolled like thunder, followed by the rustling of something large moving through the underbrush. The aliens froze. The Vril's feathers bristled, and the Koresh drew his claws. Marcus whispered without turning his head. Noise attracts. Light reveals. Keep still. They obeyed, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of trust. The sound passed after a few minutes, fading into the direction of the riverbed. Only then did Marcus speak again. "We'll need to stay off the ground tonight." He gestured upward to the massive tree roots forming natural arches. "We can string hammocks between them with this." He lifted the rope and began tying knots against a thick root, demonstrating the pattern. The others watched in silence, mesmerized by his calm. It took hours, but the first rough shelters took shape. Makeshift hammocks woven from vines and leaves. Marcus climbed into one, testing the strength, and nodded in approval. The insectoid Talor imitated his technique awkwardly, her limbs trembling as she tied fibers with delicate precision. The Koresh followed reluctantly, grunting as he hauled himself onto the vine bed. The Vril, lighter than the others, simply wrapped herself in a cocoon of leaves suspended by the rope Marcus had made. When they were done, a strange peace settled over the clearing. The alien cadets, who had been trembling minutes before, now rested under a roof of living green. The acid dew dripped harmlessly onto the leaves above them, hissing faintly as it slid away. Marcus didn't sleep. He lay with his eyes open, listening to the sounds of the alien jungle, the rhythmic chirps, the distant bellows, the occasional snap of branches. He felt the soreness in his fingers, the sting of raw skin where the fibers had cut through. It was good pain, the kind that meant progress. He thought of the instructors who had mocked humanity's reliance on primitive problem-solving, claiming that Death Worlders were too reliant on brute instinct. He smiled to himself in the dark. Instinct wasn't primitive. It was ancient knowledge written in muscle and bone, passed down through every storm, every hunger, every fight for fire. When morning came, the cadets woke to find Marcus already gone. They panicked at first, calling out for him in different languages, their voices echoing through the fog. Moments later, he emerged from the trees carrying long, straight branches stripped of bark. "Spears," he said simply, "but before we hunt or fight, we need to build. This place doesn't want us alive, so we'll make it want us." The aliens stared at him as if he were something other than human. Maybe he was. Maybe survival, to them, had always been theoretical, a test of intellect and procedure. To Marcus, it was life itself. He began sorting the branches by size, explaining how each could become a frame, a weapon, or a tool. The Koresh, still proud but shaken, picked up a branch and mimicked his grip. Talor began gathering vines. Even the Vril, her delicate wings trembling, helped carry leaves. By the time the sun had fully risen, the clearing had transformed. The shelters stood firmer. The cadets were moving with purpose. The jungle still loomed vast and hostile around them. But something had changed. The chaos no longer owned them. It belonged, if only slightly, to the human who had looked at nothing and seen possibility. Marcus watched them work and felt the faintest pull of pride. This was just the beginning. Tools would come. Fire would come. But the first victory was already won. Panic had turned into action. And that was the difference between extinction and survival. By the second day, the fragile rhythm Marcus had built began to crumble. The morning sun on Vega 9 rose like a burning wound, flooding the clearing in dull amber light that turned the air thick and metallic. The acid dew from the night had eaten small holes into the leaves of the shelters, leaving faint smoke rising where drops met the ground. The alien cadets awoke in silence, exhausted and hungry. The Koresh's scales had lost their bright sheen, dulled by dehydration. The Vril's feathers clumped together with residue from the dew, heavy and limp. Talor, the insectoid, moved slowly, her once vibrant carapace coated in a fine gray dust. None of them spoke. Panic didn't erupt immediately. It seeped back in like mist. Marcus could sense it before it began. He had seen that same hollow stare in survival trainees on Earth, just before rational thought broke and desperation took over. He moved among them, checking the makeshift hammocks and ropes, his hands still raw from the previous night's work. The fibers had left deep grooves across his palms, now red and swollen. Each movement sent small pulses of pain through his fingers, but he ignored it. He had no choice. He was already thinking ahead. Food, clean water, stability. The others sat near the center of the clearing, clutching their chests or staring blankly at the trees. "We can't eat anything here," the Koresh muttered, breaking the silence. His voice was hoarse and bitter. "Everything burns. Everything kills." The Vryle looked up weakly. "We were never meant to live like this. This is madness. The instructors want us dead." Marcus crouched beside them and spoke evenly. "No one's dying here. Not today. You just don't know what to look for yet." He stood and walked toward the edge of the clearing, where the dense foliage gave way to an incline that descended into mist. From there, a faint trickle echoed, a sound that made his heart quicken. Water. He gestured for the others to follow. "Come on, bring the vines." The Koresh scowled. "What for? We can't drink poison." Marcus didn't answer. He knelt by the slope and brushed aside the undergrowth until he found the source, a narrow stream that shimmered strangely in the light. He dipped a stick into it and watched the surface react. The tip smoked faintly but didn't dissolve. "Not acid," he murmured, more to himself than to them. "Just mineral." He broke the branch and dropped the piece into the current. When it didn't dissolve, he nodded. "We can work with this." He motioned for the others to bring large leaves. With careful hands, he layered the leaves together, folded the edges, and sealed them using fine vine fibers, creating a crude pouch. He scooped the water, letting it settle for a few seconds before holding it up. "See the sediment? We'll filter it through sand later. For now, we boil it." The Vryle tilted her head. "With what fire?" Marcus looked at her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "We'll make one." He walked back to the camp and started searching for dry material beneath the tree roots where the acid hadn't reached. His movements were deliberate, practiced. Every fiber of his body ached from the effort, but he didn't let it show. The cadets followed reluctantly, watching as he stripped bark from branches and began rubbing two sticks together with controlled rhythm. The Koresh scoffed, crossing his thick arms. "That won't work. Even our species abandoned that technique centuries ago." Marcus said nothing. His breathing slowed, his jaw clenched, and the sound of friction filled the air. Minutes passed, then a spark, tiny, fragile, but real. He caught it in a handful of fibrous shavings and blew gently until a thin flame blossomed. The Vryle gasped softly, covering her mouth with both hands. Even the cynical Koresh stepped closer, disbelief flickering in his yellow eyes. Marcus placed the leaf pouch over the flame, balancing it carefully on two stones. "It's not perfect," he said quietly, "but it'll keep us alive." The smell of boiling water filled the air, metallic and faintly sweet. When the steam cleared, Marcus poured the liquid into a split gourd and handed it to the Vryle. She hesitated, staring at it as if it were a miracle. "It's safe," he assured her. She drank cautiously, her eyes closing as the water touched her tongue. For the first time since the drop, her breathing slowed. The Koresh followed, then Talor. None of them spoke while they drank. It wasn't just water. It was proof that survival was possible. Marcus sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead. He allowed himself a single deep breath before looking up again. "We need food next," he said, "and something to defend ourselves with." Those sounds last night weren't the wind. The others exchanged uneasy glances. The Koresh finally spoke. "We don't have claws sharp enough to hunt. The creatures here are armored. Even if we could catch one, our teeth can't break through that." Marcus nodded. "That's why we use leverage." He picked up one of the longer branches from the pile he had collected earlier and began shaping one end with a sharpened stone. He worked patiently, scraping and twisting until the tip formed a rough point. He held it up. "A spear," he said simply. The Koresh blinked. "A stick?" Marcus's expression hardened slightly. "A tool." He handed it to him. "Throw it at that trunk." The reptilian hesitated, then hurled it. The spear struck the tree with a hollow thud and bounced off. "Try again," Marcus said. "Harder." On the second throw, the sharpened point pierced the bark and stuck. The Koresh stepped back, staring at it as if he had just broken a law of physics. Hours passed as Marcus taught them to carve and balance spears. He showed Talor how to braid vines into grips, and the Vrial how to create throwing lines from thin fibers. His voice was steady, instructional, but firm. Every time one of them hesitated, he made them start over. Precision, he reminded them, not strength. Let the tool do the work. Slowly, the frustration faded from their faces, replaced by concentration. By evening, the clearing was ringed with sharpened branches standing upright in the soil. Primitive, but imposing. The cadets stared at what they had made, disbelief shifting into something else, pride. As dusk fell, the air grew cold again. The acid dew began to gather on the upper leaves, but this time the cadets didn't panic. Marcus lit another small fire beneath the central shelter and began weaving additional ropes, humming quietly to himself. The others gathered closer. The Vrial, usually reserved, leaned forward, her voice soft. "How do you know all this? Your kind lives on a death world, but you act like this is familiar." Marcus looked into the firelight for a long moment before answering. "Because it is. My ancestors did this for thousands of years before we built ships and machines. We just never forgot how to start over." The Koresh frowned, his tone skeptical. "You think knowledge like this will save us? This world eats metal, burns skin, poisons air. It will not spare us because we build fires." Marcus met his gaze. "It doesn't need to spare us. We adapt faster than it can kill." The reptilian turned away, unsettled but thoughtful. Silence followed, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft hum of nocturnal creatures awakening in the dark. Later that night, Marcus climbed one of the thicker trees near camp. The branches were slick, but his rope-calloused hands found steady holds. From above, the jungle stretched endlessly, waves of green and shadow under twin moons. Distant lights shimmered between the trees, glowing like veins beneath the surface of the world. He watched for a long while, his mind turning over every possible scenario. He had no illusions. This place was designed to break them, to force them to prove that survival wasn't about strength, but adaptation. The others below were still fragile, but something had shifted in them. They were watching him now, learning without realizing it. When he climbed down, the Koresh was standing near the fire, holding one of the finished spears. "I tried what you said," he murmured, "about letting the tool do the work." He lifted the weapon and tested its balance. "It feels right." Marcus nodded. "Good. You'll need that instinct soon." He didn't explain further. The jungle around them pulsed with sound. Chirps, growls, the distant thunder of something massive moving through the underbrush. He could tell the others heard it too. Fear still lingered in their eyes, but it was quieter now, tempered by action. He checked the rope lines, reinforced the shelter walls, and added more stones to the perimeter fire. The night settled heavy and still. The others eventually drifted into uneasy sleep, but Marcus remained awake, tracing plans in the dirt with a stick, patterns for traps, rope nets, and barriers. His mind worked through exhaustion, every thought a step toward control. He knew the panic would return eventually, as it always did, but he also knew something had changed. The cadets no longer saw themselves as victims of the trial. They were beginning to see what he saw. A living world that could be understood and bent, one vine and one spark at a time. Before dawn, as the faint gray light began to creep through the trees, Marcus finally allowed himself to lie back. His body ached, his fingers throbbed, and his throat burned from the acidic air. But when he looked at the small fire still glowing beside the shelter, he smiled faintly. The camp had survived another night. Panic had not won. And for the first time, he believed that maybe, just maybe, the alien cadets were beginning to understand what it meant to be human. The third day on Vega 9 began under an unnatural silence. The jungle, usually deafening with its chorus of insects and unseen beasts, was still. Even the mist seemed to move slower, thick with tension. Marcus woke first, his body stiff from another night of half-sleep. He rolled out of his hammock and crouched near the embers of the dying fire. The smoke rose weakly, curling into the wet air before fading. He fed it a few strips of bark and watched as the orange glow returned, dim but steady. His muscles protested every movement. His hands were swollen, the skin torn and scarred, but he didn't stop. The ache had become part of him now, a reminder that he was still alive. The alien cadets began to stir soon after. The Koresh was the first, his heavy frame shifting among the ropes that held his shelter. He climbed down clumsily, muttering in frustration as his claws scraped the vine bark. The Vryle followed, stretching her fragile wings before folding them tightly against her back. Her feathers were still damp, and the acidic residue had eaten small holes into the outer layer. She hid it poorly, trying not to show the pain. Talor, the insectoid, emerged last, carrying one of the sharpened spears Marcus had made the previous day. She moved with careful precision as if rehearsing every step. Marcus noticed it immediately, the subtle change in posture, the newfound focus. They were learning, even if they didn't realize it yet. He gathered them near the fire. "We need to move deeper today," he said quietly. "We can't stay in one place too long. This clearing is too exposed." The Koresh frowned. "We have walls. We have fire. You want us to leave all that?" Marcus shook his head. "The predators here are curious. The smell of smoke travels far. We need new ground, higher and drier." The Koresh's nostrils flared, but he said nothing. The Vryle looked uneasy. "If we move, we lose what we built." Marcus met her gaze. "We built it once. We can build it again. The goal isn't to keep one camp alive. It's to learn how to make any camp survive." He led the way through the trees, cutting a path with a sharpened spear. The jungle closed in quickly, vines brushing against his face, leaves glistening with acidic droplets that hissed when they touched the ground. The cadets followed in single file, silent but alert. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of soil under boots, the slow hum of alien insects, the distant splash of something large moving through water. Hours passed as they advanced. The terrain changed subtly. The soil became rockier, the vegetation thinner. Eventually, the group reached a small plateau overlooking a valley filled with fog. Marcus paused and scanned the view. The mist below glowed faintly blue, illuminated by bioluminescent plants. The sight was hauntingly beautiful, but wrong. Beauty on Vega 9 always hid danger. He crouched near the edge and studied the patterns in the fog. "Water source down there," he murmured. "Maybe a lake or a swamp. Good for fish, bad for breathing." The Koresh leaned closer, sniffing the air. "The wind comes from there. Smells like decay." Marcus nodded. "Then we stay up here, build high. If the predators move through the valley, we'll see them first." He pointed to a cluster of thick trees near the ridge. "We can anchor shelters between those trunks. The roots are strong, and the elevation keeps us safe from the acid mist." The cadets began to work without instruction. The Koresh dragged branches and bark, using his strength to lift what Marcus couldn't. The Vryle gathered leaves and fibers, while Talor stripped vines and began weaving rope. Marcus moved among them, correcting angles, tightening knots, demonstrating how to twist the fibers until they hummed under tension. Every motion had purpose. The camp began to take form. 3 suspended shelters linked by rope bridges, each protected by layers of leaves woven to repel the dew. It wasn't elegant, but it was alive. By midday, the heat had become unbearable. The sun on Vega 9 wasn't white or yellow, but pale gold, diffused through thick clouds that glowed faintly green. The air shimmered, making the world ripple like liquid. Marcus wiped the sweat from his forehead, his throat dry. He needed to find food before nightfall. He turned to the group. "I'll go down to the lower ridge," he said. "There might be fruit or roots near the fog line. Stay here and finish the shelters. If something moves, use the signal rope." He tapped one of the vine cords that ran between their shelters. 3 pulls means danger. 2 means all clear. The Koresh looked uneasy. "You shouldn't go alone. The valley reeks of predators." Marcus adjusted his grip on his spear. "I'll be fine. I move quieter than you." He started down the slope before anyone could argue. The ground grew slick as he descended, covered in moss that pulsed faintly under his boots. He stopped to examine it, pressing his fingers into the soft texture. When he pulled back, the moss oozed a clear liquid that hissed when it touched the ground. Acidic defense mechanism, he realized. The planet itself was alive in ways most species couldn't comprehend. He moved slower, marking the trail with small notches in the bark. Halfway down, he found what he was looking for, clusters of bulbous plants clinging to the rocks, their surfaces glossy and red. He tapped one lightly with his spear, and it burst open with a splash of pinkish liquid. He caught some on his palm, sniffed it, then touched it to his tongue. Sweet. Edible. The sugar was faint, but real. He collected as many as he could, cutting them loose with careful precision. As he worked, a sound drifted through the air, a low growl, close and deep. He froze, turning his head slowly. The mist shifted. Something was moving in it. Marcus crouched, lowering his body behind a fallen log. The noise came again, accompanied by the heavy thud of footsteps. Through the fog, he caught a glimpse of movement. 4 legs, scales glistening faintly blue, eyes like molten glass. The creature was larger than a bear, its jaws lined with curved tusks that dripped with saliva. It sniffed the air, tracking the scent of the fruit. Marcus's pulse quickened. He gripped his spear tighter, calculating distance and angles. He had no illusions of killing it. His only chance was to stay unseen. The beast moved closer, its nostrils flaring. Marcus pressed his back against the rock and held his breath. The seconds stretched. The creature stopped only a few meters away. He could hear the wet click of its jaw, the slow rumble of its breathing. Then, from the ridge above, came 3 sharp tugs on the vine signal. Danger! His chest tightened. The camp was under threat too. The beast lifted its head, alerted by the vibration. Marcus knew he had to act. He reached into his pouch, pulled out a piece of the red fruit, and tossed it across the clearing. The creature's head snapped toward the sound. The moment it moved, Marcus sprinted uphill, keeping low, his boots sliding on the wet rock. He reached the ridge, gasping for breath. The scene above made his stomach twist. 2 smaller predators, gray, sleek, fast, were circling the camp. The Koresh stood on one of the bridges, brandishing his spear, while the Vryle clung to a branch above, her wings spread wide to distract them. Talor was crouched near the fire pit, clutching another spear with shaking limbs. Marcus didn't hesitate. He grabbed one of the weighted ropes from the nearest shelter and swung it across the clearing, wrapping it around the leg of the nearest predator. The creature shrieked and stumbled, crashing into the tree roots. "Now!" Marcus shouted. The Koresh lunged forward and drove his spear into the creature's side. The second predator snarled and leapt at him, but Marcus intercepted it with a quick thrust, striking its throat. The battle lasted only minutes, but it left the camp covered in blood and torn leaves. The predators lay still, their gray hides smoking faintly from the acidic air. The Vryle landed awkwardly, trembling from exhaustion. The Koresh's chest heaved, his claws dripping with blood. Not all of it the enemy's. Marcus dropped his weapon and crouched beside the fallen beasts. "We can use this," he said quietly. "Bones for tools, hides for protection." The Koresh stared at him in disbelief. "You want to use these things?" Marcus nodded. "Every part of them. Waste nothing." As the day faded into dusk, the camp became a workshop of survival. The Vryle skinned the hides with sharp stones, while Talor extracted bones for spearheads. Marcus demonstrated how to heat the bones over the fire until they hardened into ivory-colored blades. He tied them to the ends of spears with twisted fibers, testing their balance. The Koresh sat nearby, silent but alert, watching every motion. By the time the moons rose, they had a full set of weapons, crude but deadly. That night, the cadets gathered around the fire, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the flames. The smell of burned meat from the predators filled the air, harsh but nourishing. Marcus sat quietly, turning a bone spear in his hands. The Koresh finally broke the silence. "We fought like one unit today," he said, his tone low. "Not like cadets, not like rivals, like survivors." Marcus met his eyes and nodded once. "That's the point. The trial isn't about endurance, it's about transformation." Above them, the sky shimmered with distant lightning. The jungle murmured again, alive but cautious, as if acknowledging their presence. For the first time since the drop, Marcus felt something close to pride, not just in himself, but in them. The firelight danced on their faces, and for a fleeting moment, the human and the aliens were not separate species, but one fragile, determined force against a world that wanted them dead. The night would bring new dangers, but for now, they had won, and the jungle, at least for a few hours, seemed to know it. The fourth dawn on Vega 9 arrived without light. A thick storm front had rolled across the jungle during the night, smothering the moons and turning the world into a gray blur of motion and sound. The rain was not the kind that refreshed. It hissed when it touched the ground, thick with mineral acids that scarred bark and carved shallow burns into exposed skin. The shelters Marcus and the cadets had built held firm, but the air beneath them was heavy with tension. No one spoke for a long time. The camp that had once felt alive now seemed swallowed by the planet's will, as if Vega 9 itself had decided to test their right to exist on its surface. Marcus sat closest to the fire pit, watching the embers struggle for oxygen in the damp air. His mind was restless, turning over every detail of the last confrontation. The predators they had killed the night before had not been random wanderers. They were scouts, smaller members of a larger pack. He had seen the claw patterns on the trees, the distinct spacing between marks that meant coordination. Something intelligent hunted these jungles, and he knew the reprieve would not last. The storm would mask sound and scent, but when it cleared, the pack would return. The Koresh sat near the entrance of his shelter, sharpening one of the bone-tipped spears Marcus had made. Each stroke of the stone against the bone was slow, deliberate. His yellow eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, reflecting something harder than fear: focus. The Vryle crouched near the hanging hides, repairing a tear in one of them with strands of vine fiber. Her wings were folded tightly behind her back, still bruised from the fight. Talor worked silently beside her, polishing the hardened shell fragments that Marcus had ordered saved. Every movement in the camp was efficient now. The chaos of their first days was gone. Survival had become habit. Marcus stood and stretched his shoulders, his muscles aching from days of strain. "The storm won't last forever," he said, his voice barely rising above the wind. "When it clears, we move again. Higher ground. If those things are coming, I want to meet them where we have the advantage." The Koresh looked up from his spear. "You speak as if you know they will come." Marcus nodded slowly. "Because I would, if I were them." The reptilian tilted his head. "You think like a predator." Marcus didn't argue. "That's why I'm still alive." He stepped outside the shelter, letting the acidic rain patter against the animal hide draped over his shoulders. The droplets hissed faintly, but rolled off harmlessly thanks to the oil he had smeared on the surface earlier. He scanned the horizon where the storm clouds twisted in slow spirals, glowing faintly from the static discharge beneath them. The jungle below shifted with the wind, trees swaying like waves in an endless ocean. Somewhere in the distance, he saw flashes of movement, brief, silver streaks that disappeared as quickly as they appeared. The predators were watching, waiting. He could feel it in the air, a pressure that wasn't just from the storm. By midday, the rain began to thin. The cadets used the break to secure their supplies. Talor reinforced the rope lines between shelters, while the Vryle tested the glide distance from the ridge, measuring the wind strength. The Koresh remained near the fire, methodically carving grooves into the bone spears. Marcus joined him and knelt beside the small pile of sharpened tips. "We'll need traps," he said. "If the pack comes, we can't fight them head-on again. We'll use the terrain." The Koresh grunted in approval. "What do you suggest?" Marcus drew in the dirt with the tip of a stick, a simple diagram of pits and choke points, with vines serving as triggers. "Trip lines here. Drop spears from above. If we drive them toward this ridge, the ground will do the rest." The Koresh studied the plan and nodded slowly. "It could work, but we'll need time." Marcus glanced at the fading storm. "Then we start now." The following hours blurred into motion. The jungle became their workshop. Marcus directed the effort with precision, splitting the group into pairs. The Koresh used his strength to dig shallow pits with his claws, while Marcus wove vine nets strong enough to hold weight. The Vryle climbed trees to set anchor points, her light frame perfect for maneuvering through the high branches. Talor followed Marcus closely, learning to tie knots with her slender limbs. For the first time, she seemed calm. Every action had purpose. Every motion was survival made visible. As the afternoon deepened, Marcus found himself listening to the rhythm of their work. The scrape of bone against stone, the rustle of leaves, the muted growl of distant thunder. It was almost peaceful, in a brutal kind of way. He realized then how much the others had changed. The fear that had once ruled them was still there, buried deep, but it no longer defined them. The Koresh no longer hissed in frustration when a tool broke. He fixed it. The Vryle no longer trembled when her feathers brushed acid dew. She wiped it off and continued. Even Talor, who had once curled into herself at every sound, now moved with quiet confidence. The human influence had spread like fire, uncontrolled, consuming, but necessary. By the time the sun dipped below the canopy, their traps were ready. The ridge was lined with spears angled outward, the pits camouflaged with leaves, and the trip lines hidden among the vines. The final touch was a signal line that ran through the center of the camp, tied to the shelters. 3 tugs would mean the predators were coming. Marcus tested it twice, his fingers brushing the cord lightly. The tension felt perfect. As night fell, the storm broke completely. The air grew still, unnervingly so. The jungle that had been howling only hours before was now silent again. Marcus felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He could sense movement beyond the trees, the kind of subtle shift that only predators made. He crouched near the fire and gestured for the others to stay quiet. The Koresh gripped his spear. The Vryle folded her wings, and Talor froze mid-motion. Seconds stretched into minutes. Then came the sound, a low growl, deeper than before, rolling like thunder through the valley. Marcus rose slowly and motioned toward the ridge. He moved silently, spear in hand, eyes locked on the darkness ahead. The others followed his lead. The first shadow appeared between the trees, massive, deliberate, glowing faintly from the bioluminescent veins along its flanks. The pack leader, its eyes reflected the firelight in twin bands of molten gold. Behind it, smaller shapes slithered through the foliage, each step synchronized. Marcus exhaled slowly. "Positions," he whispered. The attack came fast. The lead predator lunged from the shadows, jaws snapping, its body crashing into the perimeter. The hidden spears pierced its side, drawing a roar that shook the trees. Marcus shouted, "Now!" The Vryle yanked one of the vines, triggering a rain of sharpened stakes from above. 2 more predators fell, screeching, their bodies thrashing against the ground. The Koresh charged forward with a roar of his own, driving his spear into the neck of a third. The air filled with the sound of flesh tearing and vines snapping. Acidic blood sprayed across the ground, hissing wherever it landed. Marcus ducked beneath a swinging tail and drove his spear upward, the bone tip cracking through scale and into muscle. The creature collapsed, dragging him down with it. He hit the dirt hard, his ribs screaming in pain. He rolled aside just in time to avoid the strike of another. The Vryle swooped down from the trees, slashing with sharpened bone fragments tied to her wrists. The predator reared back, howling, and Marcus seized the chance to stab it again. The battle raged for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than minutes. When it ended, the jungle fell silent once more. The ground was slick with blood and rainwater. The predators lay still, their bodies half submerged in the pits they had dug. Marcus leaned against a tree, his chest heaving. His arms trembled from exhaustion, and his face was streaked with grime and blood. The Koresh limped toward him, clutching his side where a claw had torn through his armor of vines. "You were right," he said between breaths. "They came for us." Marcus nodded. "And now we come for them." The Koresh frowned. "What do you mean?" Marcus pushed himself upright and looked toward the valley where the fog still glowed faintly. "That was only part of the pack. The rest will follow the scent of their dead. We strike before they do." The others gathered around him, listening in silence. The firelight flickered across their faces, revealing something new in their expressions. Trust. Not blind obedience, but belief earned through struggle. Marcus met each of their eyes in turn. "Tomorrow," he said, "we end this. No more running. We take the fight to them." The Koresh straightened, gripping his spear tightly. The Vryle's wings lifted slightly, ready for flight. Talor clicked her mandibles in determination. The human's voice dropped lower. "We survive by building. Now we build victory." As the wind rose again, carrying the scent of blood across the valley, Marcus stood alone at the edge of the ridge. The storm clouds had thinned enough for one of the moons to break through, painting the jungle in silver light. He stared into the distance, where the faint shapes of the surviving predators moved like shadows in the mist. His heartbeat steadied, matching the rhythm of the planet itself. Vega 9 had tested them in every way imaginable: fear, hunger, pain. But now it had created something far more dangerous than any beast lurking in its jungles. It had forged a human leading aliens who had learned to fight, to think, and to adapt. And as the night deepened, Marcus knew one truth with unshakable certainty. The real trial was no longer about survival. It was about dominance. The dawn that followed was unlike any other since the cadets had landed on Vega 9. The jungle was silent again, but this time the silence carried a different weight. It was not the uneasy quiet of fear or waiting. It was the stillness that comes after the hunt, when even the wind seems to hold its breath. The air was thick with the scent of scorched sap and blood from the night's battle, and faint wisps of steam rose from the pits where the predators' bodies still smoldered. Marcus sat beside the dying fire, his back against a tree, his hands resting on his knees. His spear leaned across his shoulder, its tip dulled and blackened. He had not slept at all. The adrenaline that had kept him alive through the night was gone, replaced by the slow, heavy exhaustion that seeped into his bones. He looked around at what was left of the camp. The shelters were still standing, though several were torn at the edges. The ropes were frayed, the leaves punctured, but the structures had held. The Koresh was awake, sitting on a rock, inspecting the cut on his shoulder. He had bound it tightly with strips of hide. The Vryle was perched on a branch above, her wings spread wide to dry in the weak sunlight that filtered through the clouds. Talor moved between the fallen predators, carefully cutting strips of meat with a sharpened bone shard. She worked with calm precision, her movements steady and methodical. None of them spoke. Words had become unnecessary. Marcus stood slowly, his body stiff, and walked toward the edge of the ridge. The fog below had thinned during the night, revealing the valley that stretched far beyond their sight. The vegetation shimmered faintly in the morning light, alive again after the storm. Somewhere down there, he knew, the rest of the pack was moving. He could feel it in the rhythm of the jungle, the slow pulse of something gathering strength. He took a deep breath and turned back to the camp. "We move in 1 hour," he said quietly. "No more waiting." The Koresh looked up, his yellow eyes narrowing. "You mean to finish this?" Marcus nodded. "Before it finishes us." The preparation was efficient. Every tool, every weapon, every fragment of bone had a purpose. The cadets moved with silent understanding, checking each spear and rope twice. The Vryle tested the gliding harness Marcus had made for her from woven vines and predator sinew. It would allow her to scout from above without exposing herself for too long. Talor filled small pouches with powdered resin and bits of moss that burned brightly when lit, a primitive signal flare Marcus had taught her to make. The Koresh gathered the heavier weapons, his muscles tense with anticipation. When everything was ready, Marcus stepped to the center of the camp. "We end this as one," he said firmly. "We strike fast, use the traps, force them uphill. The pack is led by the Alpha, the largest one with the gold eyes. Take him down, and the rest will scatter." The Koresh grunted in agreement. "Then let us hunt." They moved before the sun reached its peak. The descent into the valley was slow and tense. The ground was soft underfoot, soaked from the storm. The deeper they went, the darker it became. The light above filtered through layers of mist and broad leaves, turning the air into a dim green haze. The sounds of the jungle grew louder again. Distant calls, rustling branches, the low hum of insects. The Vryle climbed into the canopy and disappeared from sight, gliding silently through the treetops while the others advanced on foot. Marcus followed the faint tracks left by the predators, deep impressions in the mud, streaked with dried blood. It did not take long to find them. The clearing at the center of the valley was littered with bones. Massive trees formed a natural ring around it, their roots twisting into mounds that looked almost deliberate, like fortifications. In the center stood the Alpha. It was enormous, its scales gleaming like burnished iron. Its eyes burned with the same molten gold he had seen before. Around it, 4 smaller beasts circled, snarling quietly. Marcus crouched low behind a fallen trunk and signaled the others to spread out. The Koresh moved to the left, silent despite his size. Talor crept to the right, her body blending into the shadows. Marcus waited for the signal from above. A faint flash of light flickered through the canopy. The Vryle's signal. Marcus raised his hand and then dropped it. The first trap sprang. A net of woven vines and sharpened stakes snapped upward from the ground, ensnaring one of the smaller predators and pulling it off balance. It shrieked, thrashing violently. The Koresh lunged from the left, driving his spear into another, pinning it against a root. Marcus moved forward in the same instant, his steps quick and silent. He aimed straight for the Alpha. The massive creature turned toward him, roaring so loudly that the trees shook. Its claws gouged the soil as it charged. Marcus rolled aside at the last second, feeling the rush of air as the beast's weight crashed into the ground. He swung his spear and struck its flank, the bone tip splintering on impact but cutting deep enough to draw blood. The creature's tail whipped around, slamming into his chest and throwing him backward. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. The Koresh roared and leapt onto the creature's back, driving his weapon down with all his strength. The Alpha bucked wildly, throwing him aside like a rag. Talor darted in and hurled one of the resin pouches into its open mouth. The flare ignited instantly, filling the air with smoke and fire. The beast thrashed, blinded, and enraged. Marcus struggled to his feet, gasping. He grabbed a broken spear from the ground, its tip jagged and sharp, and ran toward the creature again. "Now!" he shouted. The Vryle dove from above, her wings slicing through the air as she released another burning pouch directly onto the Alpha's head. The flare burst in a blinding flash. The creature reared back, its roar shaking the entire valley. Marcus didn't hesitate. He drove the spear upward, straight through the creature's exposed throat. The resistance was immense, the impact jarring his arms, but he pushed until he felt it break through. The beast convulsed, then collapsed, the sound of its fall echoing through the trees. The silence that followed was deafening. The surviving predators hesitated, circling the fallen Alpha in confusion. The Koresh, bloodied but unbroken, raised his spear and shouted, a deep, guttural sound that resonated through the clearing. The beasts flinched, then turned and fled into the jungle. One by one, their shapes vanished into the mist. Marcus dropped his weapon, breathing hard, and sank to his knees. The air smelled of blood and smoke. The valley that had once been their grave had become their victory ground. The others gathered around him. The Vryle landed lightly beside the Alpha's corpse, her feathers streaked with soot, but her eyes bright. Talor approached quietly, her carapace glinting in the firelight. The Koresh stood tall, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. No one spoke for several minutes. Then Marcus finally said, "It's done." The words sounded strange in the quiet, fragile, and final. The Koresh nodded. "You led us to this." Marcus shook his head slowly. "We led each other." The trek back to the ridge was long and quiet. The sky cleared as they climbed, revealing Vega 9's twin moons hovering side by side, their light silver and soft. By the time they reached their camp, exhaustion had replaced adrenaline. They collapsed near the fire pit, too tired to speak. Marcus sat with his back against the same tree where he had watched the storm 2 nights before. The flames reflected in his eyes, and for the first time since landing on the planet, he allowed himself to exhale fully. The weight of survival, of leadership, of being the one expected to hold everything together, lifted slightly from his shoulders. The following morning, the extraction beacon finally activated. The Proctor's ship descended through the clouds, its engines scattering the mist across the ridge. The cadets stood together, watching as the metal platform unfolded and the Academy insignia gleamed in the sunlight. When the Proctor stepped out, their expressions shifted from curiosity to disbelief. The students they had expected to find half dead or feral were standing tall, their shelters intact, their weapons organized neatly in a line. The Koresh bowed his head slightly, the Vryle folded her wings, and Talor stepped back behind Marcus. One of the instructors approached him. "Report, Cadet Hale," he said sharply. Marcus met his gaze. His voice was calm but firm. "We completed the trial. We built, fought, and survived. Vega 9 did not break us." The instructor looked past him at the others and then at the camp. "You turned this place into a settlement." Marcus glanced at the others and nodded once. "That was the only way to live here. Alone, we would have failed. Together, we changed the rules." Later, as the ship lifted from the planet's surface, Marcus stood by the viewing window, watching the jungle shrink below. The scars of the battles were visible even from above. Patches of burned trees, pits filled with rainwater, trails carved through the foliage. But amid the destruction were signs of life. Vines regrowing, new shoots breaking through the soil, the jungle healing itself. He thought of the lessons Vega 9 had carved into him, the raw simplicity of survival, the power of cooperation, and the unshakable resilience of will. When the ship broke through the clouds and the stars filled the sky, Marcus finally allowed himself to close his eyes. The others sat nearby in silence, bound by something no academy could teach, a bond forged in fear, in fire, and in triumph. He knew that once they returned, the reports would speak of tactics, strategy, and efficiency. But what none of the proctors would ever understand was that the real test had not been about surviving Vega 9. It had been about proving that even in the most hostile corner of the galaxy, humanity's strength lay not in weapons or technology, but in its relentless instinct to adapt, to build, and to endure. And so, the legend began. The story of the human who twisted fiber into rope, into spears, into shelter, and in doing so, taught an entire generation of alien cadets what it truly meant to be alive.